In tonight's Dorchester segment, we have updates on a police-involved shooting, frustrations with the MBTA, and concerns over education. To fill us in is the news editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Jennifer, I want to start with the police-involved shooting. There was a 19-year-old man who was shot by police. The department says, there was an exchange of gunfire two ways here. What have you found out since then?
So since the initial report, which as you noted, everyone knew ended with police shooting a 19-year-old fatally on Penhallow Street in Dorchester near the Fields Corner area, what we've learned since then is that since there was no actual body camera footage of the incident itself, that neighbors have actually come forward and confirmed to us, and also since then the Globe, that the police account that they were asking the young man to drop his weapon and asked several times was also actually backed up by neighbors who were standing outside and also calling for him to drop his gun. One witness, Leonard Lee, who lives on that street, who says he was out there also shouting to drop the weapon, said that the man himself actually fired a few shots off at the police before they fired and shot his leg. And then the exchange of gunfire continued until the 19-year-old himself, who was identified yesterday, was actually fatally shot. So we are in this kind of odd situation where it is in District C11, which, as people might recall, is one of the areas of the city where the body cameras are in place with those local officers. But because they were responding to an initial report around 5:15 p.m. On Monday night to a shooting in Town Field that ultimately no one was injured in, bicycle cops were the ones that actually responded, and the citywide bicycle units do not have body cameras. So they showed up and actually chased down one of these young men while another escaped and has since been arrested. And they did not have any camera footage, but the C11 officers who did respond later did have camera footage, but only of the aftermath. So the police seem fairly confident right now that they handled it in the correct way. And it's interesting that the neighbors actually are saying that the police did handle this with a certain amount of discretion. But of course, it's a tragedy for everyone involved.
Now, I know this has no bearing on the police shooting itself, but as a context, gunshots being fired near Town Field a little before 6 p.m. in late June. A lot of people in the neighborhood are probably pretty nervous about that.
Yes, I mean, you do see this every summer. At this point, there's always a summer safety gathering that police have, that the mayor has, because in the summer you see a spike in violence, you see a spike in shootings. I'm sure there's a certain amount of nervousness now since we're going into July 4th weekend, which is also when we see a spike in shootings. But yes, especially when you're talking about kind of common areas like Town Field, where if you have people that are armed and they're hanging out in the open, and it's a season when kind of everyone is outside, these altercations tend to happen more often than in the winter months when people are a little bit more cordoned off. So yes, people are pretty nervous right now because you do see the annual spike in violence around the summer, and for one of the homicides so far to have involved a standoff between the police and a local young man is not really leaving people feeling great.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Jennifer, problems with the Red Line in Dorchester and elsewhere are not really that much newsworthy because they happen so often, but you had one problem recently with a derailment. This has almost turned into a gut check. Why?
I think it's because for a lot of us who depend on the Red Line and the T on a regular basis, we've kind of accepted this idea that it's just not really the system that we want and or deserve at this point. But there was a certain element of shock after the derailment about 2 weeks ago, which ground the entire system almost to a complete halt. The Red Line trains in between Ashmont and all the way up to Broadway had to be replaced with shuttles. They were bringing in buses from all around Greater Boston, and it very much had a ripple effect on car traffic, on other lines. So I think it really did highlight for a lot of people just how vulnerable the system is to a total meltdown when something like this happens. And one of the people that I think was struck by this was actually Governor Baker, who, it's been reported last week, I believe on Thursday, actually decided that he was going to go out to the site of the derailment and look at some of the damage that was done. Because if you'll recall, 3 signal bungalows, which controlled the spacing of the trains, the speed of the trains, the switches for that area were damaged. One of them was almost completely destroyed. So Governor Baker went out there and took a look at the system himself and did say, wow, this looks really bad. It's very damaged. Also, a lot of this infrastructure looks pretty old. I'd been reluctant before to cause inconvenience to people by shutting down trains during weekend hours or during nighttime shifts to do repairs, but I think we may have to do that. So just this week, he and T officials rolled out a plan that includes a more aggressive approach to actually shutting down stations to do repairs, but also $50 million of what they're calling a flex fund that'll go to both the capital and operational side of the train to again kind of accelerate the repairs.
What about the polling on this? Because he's taking a hit, but as far as fixing it, I mean, people don't seem to be really embracing anything all that radical either.
Yes, so there's always kind of this interesting paradox with Governor Baker and his approval ratings. So, for instance, WBUR and Mass Inc. ran a poll this week about transit, and one of the questions was, how do you think that Governor Baker has actually dealt with the issues on the MBTA? And only 29% of poll respondents thought they were dealing with it well. However, 69% of people polled still have a high favorable rating toward Governor Baker. So you have kind of this dismissal and disappointment in the actual system and the way that it's being handled, but they don't seem to really be knocking him as far as his actual overall job performance. But as you noted, Chris, it does raise the question of, well, we have a system that needs fixes, so what do we do to bring in the revenue needed to actually make repairs? And interestingly, the most popular possible new source of revenue through this polling was the resurgence of what's known as the millionaire's tax, which is a tax surcharge on those at the very, very highest income brackets. But then other options like a gas tax and a vehicle tax, those ones are not really as popular. So there is sort of this befuddlement around how do we actually approach the revenue needs of maintaining a very, very old line, and what prices are we willing to pay for it?
The other finding here, after 4 years of repairs since the big snowstorm debacle, and multiple fare increases, how much has service improved, at least as far as people feeling it?
This one is actually a little bit disheartening. So as you recall, Governor Baker actually tried to take ownership of the T right after that terrible winter. The control board was actually reformulated, and people just really don't think the T has improved all that much since 2015. And that's kind of an issue, because the way that state officials have been talking about it is, well, we're on the right trajectory. We've been making the needed investments. There's long-term planning here. But in terms of how people feel about it over the last 4 years, very, very few of them actually think it's improved at all, and quite a few think it's gotten worse.
Some education concerns. City Council unanimously approved the mayor's budget, but the council president, Andrea Campbell, had some issues with the Boston Public Schools. Explain, what was it? Was this just a gesture, or was there some real substance here?
So actually, Council President Andrea Campbell wasn't alone. She was one of 3 councilors that voted against the BPS budget in particular. So the entire budget was actually passed unanimously. It's up about $170 million over last year, but the school budget, which is up about $50 million over last year, did have 3 specific dissenting votes, and that was Lydia Edwards, who's in East Boston, who said that it demonstrated a lack of equity specifically around her district and the cuts to East Boston High School. City Council President Andrea Campbell, who actually this past week released her own recommendations for how the city should move forward with Boston Public Schools, said that she still has really profound concerns about the lack of equity across the district and differences in achievement gaps and access to high quality schools. And she says this budget does not nearly do enough to reflect that. And then the third dissenting voice was City Councilor Michelle Wu, who echoed her 2 colleagues there and said that there is a lack of an equity framework throughout the way that the Boston Public Schools are approaching this, that meant that she was not able to vote for it. Of course, this is in the context of an overwhelming number of councilors. The other 10 were going to vote for it. So it's not as though these 3 votes could have tanked the BPS budget. And one of the other most engaged voices on education, Anissa Asabi-George, who's the at-large counselor and running for re-election again this year, noted particularly that the budget itself had some things that she was really pushing for, which include a full-time nurse at every school and some additional social supports. So it was kind of a plus and minus budget, but yes, those 3 counselors decided to vote against it.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Of course. Thank you, Chris.
Jennifer Smith.